Hi everybody, and welcome to the lesson 15.4 Special Parallelograms Notes. In these notes, we are going to talk about 3 parallelograms that I think all of you have heard before, starting with a rectangle. A rectangle is a parallelogram with 4 right angles. What's important about this is because a rectangle is a parallelogram, it shares all of the same properties as a parallelogram. So we know in a parallelogram, the opposite sides are parallel and congruent. We also know that for a parallelogram, the diagonals bisect each other. And in a rectangle, the diagonals not only bisect each other, but they're also congruent. So each of these individual parts are congruent. And we also know that for a rectangle, every angle is a right angle. So opposite sides of a rectangle are congruent and parallel, just like in a normal parallelogram. All the angles in a rectangle measure 90 degrees because they're all right angles. And like I mentioned, the diagonals of a rectangle are congruent and bisect each other. Let's try applying these properties. So moving on to part B. Given quadrilateral TGIF is a rectangle, use the figure and the properties of a rectangle to find the following. So we know that TX is 13, and then find TI. Well, I know that the diagonals bisect each other and are congruent. So if TX is 13, then that means XI is 13. So in total, TI is 26, which also means that FG is 26 because the diagonals are congruent. Next, in part B, it says solve for x if TX is 4x plus 4. So this is pretending that we don't know it's 13 in a separate problem. TX is 4x plus 4, and FX is 7x minus 23. Well, we know that all of the parts of the diagonals are congruent, so I can say 4x plus 4 equals 7x minus 23. I'm going to subtract 4x on either side. And I'll add 23 to either side, leaving me with 27 equals 3x. And if I divide by 3, I get that x equals 9. And so that was all of the properties of a rectangle. Let's move on to talk about a rhombus. A rhombus is also a parallelogram, so all of the properties of a parallelogram are in play. But a rhombus has 4 congruent sides, so I know that all of the sides of a rhombus are congruent. I also know that since a rhombus is a parallelogram, that its opposite sides are parallel. So opposite sides of a rhombus are parallel. Because this is a parallelogram, I also know that the opposite angles of a rhombus are congruent. This should say rhombus. The diagonals of a rhombus not only bisect each other, but are also perpendicular, which means they intersect to form right angles. And I know that they bisect each other. And the diagonals also bisect the angles. So for instance, H is split in two, and F is split in two. And we also know that all of those parts are congruent because the opposite angles are congruent. And the halves of G are congruent, and the halves of E are congruent. A lot of markings. We also know that all the sides of a rhombus are congruent. And the diagonals of a rhombus create four congruent triangles. If you notice, I have A, S, A for all four triangles. So the diagonals of a rhombus create four congruent triangles. Now let's try applying some of these properties. Given quad UTAH is a rhombus, solve for x if UPT, so UPT is right here, is 4x plus 18. Well, we know that the diagonals of a rhombus are perpendicular, so I know that UPT is 90 degrees. So I can say 4x plus 18 equals 90 and solve for x. I'll subtract 18 to get 4x equals 72. And if I divide by 4, I get that x is equal to 18. In part B, it says solve for x if the measure of PAH is 8x plus 2, and the measure of angle PAT is 10x minus 10. Well, this is an angle split by one of the diagonals, but we know that in a rhombus, the diagonals bisect the angles, which means those two parts are congruent to one another, because the diagonals of a rhombus bisect each other. So I'm going to subtract 8x on either side. And then add 10 to either side. And if I divide by 2, I get that x is equal to 6. And those are the properties of a rhombus. For our last special parallelogram, we have a square. A square is a mix between a rhombus and a rectangle because a square is a parallelogram with 4 right angles and 4 congruent sides. So I'm going to mark all of the sides as congruent. I'm also going to put in my right angles. Since this is a parallelogram, I also know that the opposite sides are parallel. And because a square is a mix between a rectangle and a rhombus, the properties of a rectangle and a rhombus also apply to a square. For instance, the diagonals bisect each other and are congruent, just like in a rectangle. And the diagonals are perpendicular, just like they are in a rhombus. I also know that the diagonals bisect all of the angles. And if I know that all of the angles are 90 degrees, then I know that all of these individual halves are 45 degrees. So let's fill in all those properties. Opposite sides of a square are parallel, because this is a parallelogram. All the angles of a square measure 90 degrees. The diagonals of a square are perpendicular. They form right angles. They're congruent. They bisect each other. And they bisect the right angles. And all of the sides of a square are congruent. I know that these are a lot of properties. I promise that in class I am going to be giving you a chart that looks like a spreadsheet that will help you keep track of all of the different properties for all of the different quadrilaterals that we've talked about in this chapter. I hope that you are already familiar with a square, a rhombus, and a rectangle, and hopefully this video showed you more of the special properties using the geometry concepts we've talked about in this class. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you in class.